Well, kia ora and welcome to my place. This will be the first sort of structured lesson, the first real conversation that we're going to have together. And in this, I want to introduce, those concepts of place and identity and practice, three words you'll probably hear quite a bit over our time together, but interlock those with this concept of Karakia. Karakia. Now, when we first met and introduced ourselves, I opened my part of that introduction with a karakia, with a ritual incantation, or you might even think of it as a prayer. But karakia for the Indigenous people of New Zealand, I would suggest, isn't quite a prayer, but more of a way of drawing things together, of building the connections between all things. And in that karakia that I shared with you, I talked about the sky, I talked about the land, I talked about the water, I talked about many things and how they actually inform place, so how place is created through karakia and through place naming. I talked to you about, or within that, about identity, so how people, how individuals are connected to that place and to the sky and to the earth and to the sea. How that makes and builds relationships with fish and birds and plants and trees, all things. So that karakia, as an articulation of identity, places us within a construct that connects all things together. And you could say then there's a relationship between all things, between people and all other things. So with that relationship, of course, as a formational block of identity, that I have a relationship with this earth, with that water out there, with that sky, that informs practice. So it informs how I relate to and interact with those trees, that water, this earth, that sky. So, that idea of karakia, those opening words of mine, if you could read the karakia, the text of the karakia, of that incantation, was placing me within a larger picture, not just saying, here I am, it's here I am as a part of all of this other stuff, So it's a connector. It's an incantation that connects people to place, to identity, and informs practice. It's what you could call a meta-narrative. And, from the works I've done with Indigenous peoples, and I acknowledge all of those peoples out there, we all have our own meta-narratives, our own creation stories that inform who we are within a place. And in fact, if we even look at our Judeo-Christian Western background, there's a meta-narrative, there's a creation story that links people to place and to practice and identity. And that one's usually told through the Bible, isn't it? So that's a written narrative, whereas a lot of the Indigenous connections, a lot of the Indigenous meta-narratives are told orally. And I won't go too far into what Roland Barthes would say around Western practice or Western ideas or Western legitimacy favouring the written narrative over the oral, but I'll just leave that as a wee seed for you to think about. So whenever I'm thinking about my relationship with place, how it forms my identity, and I urge you to have a look through some of the other smaller videos that I've put in with me in different places talking about identity. It also informs me and reminds me constantly that I impact upon place and I'm impacted by place. I impact on place and impacted by place. So it's for me, living out here in this bush beside this sea, where my mother's been, where my uncles have been, aunties have been, where my grandparents have been, and many generations before that in this special place, this place where only our families have ever set foot. And I'll tell you more about that in the future as well. Informing my identity also forms the concepts, the practices, the customs that we embed within this place. So the things that we do here are informed by what this place is and our relationship to that place. Now, a good example of that, for customs, one of the things we do when we catch the birds is we always put the first one back. And we do that as, I suppose, as an acknowledgement of the life of that bird, but all of the other families of birds that have interacted with us in this place. So we don't just, it's for us, it's not just an idea of taking from. There's a concept of reciprocity that relies in there. If we were just to take that first bird without regarding the life of that bird or the systems that it lives within, the bird systems, the families, the land, etc., that it lives in, if we were just to take that, it would be an insult to the rest of those birds that would give their lives to us. We do the same with fish, etc. So as a custom, that giving back of that first bird is an acknowledgement of the connections that we have and of the gift giving, you could say, of the idea that the land and the sea and the sky would give us food, would give us those birds, but we would have to live in partnership with it. So, it's really interesting thinking about those customs, and for some people, those customs might be sort of, a bit far out, a bit strange, a bit weird. But for us, they're embedded by and informed by those meta-narratives. And when I talk about those meta-narratives, the birds have a relationship with the sky and the sea and the earth. They live inside burrows in the ground in the earth. They spend most of their life out on the water, and they fly in the sky. So there's all those relationships. And when we're giving that first bird back, it's an acknowledgement of, in our language, atua, which in some of the languages could be regarded as gods. So once again, it's connected to that meta-narrative. If we give back and regard the atua, the gods, then they will look after us. If we look after the birds, they will look after us. If we look after the land, it will look after us. If we look after the sea, it will look after us. So maybe, that concept of gods as something omnipotent, something, large and something we pray to. But from a very tangible, very pragmatic level, that's it there. A name for the atua, for the god of the sea, is Takaroa. There he is. Raki Nui. There he is. Papatua Nuku. There she is. So it's it's at once omnipotent, it's at once omnipresent, but it's also very real. It's not just an abstract concept, it's a very real thing that informs who we are. Now that unpacking of that idea of a custom that's informed by a mega-narrative, a meta-narrative, I'd like you to think about that meta-narrative of Christmas. Well, that custom of Christmas and the meta-narrative that informs that. And I would suggest it's a very, very similar story. We have certain processes and certain customs at Christmas time that we partake in that we don't question from our meta-narrative perspective. So, from a New Zealand perspective, what we do every Christmas is we cut a tree down, take it out of its natural environment and drag it inside and put it inside, a Christmas tree. And in New Zealand, it's usually like a pine tree, and I don't know if you know much about pine trees, but what they tend to do when they start dying and drying out, they drop needles all over the floor. So it's a bit of a crazy thing to be doing at once to pull this tree out of its natural environment, but then also, it leaves a mess in the house. We also sort of, talk a lot about Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, and snow and sleds. Now in New Zealand, Christmas time, it's in summer, not quite like here, and not quite like you're going to be encountering if you get over here in the summertime, you'll find out all about it then. But that idea that of Christmas being in winter, bringing a tree inside, those customs that we don't usually question, that are informed by a meta-narrative, the birth of Jesus. And therefore you must A, B, C and D. And some of these things have got no connection whatsoever, but have been all tied up in this other narrative. We might talk more about narrative exploration later as well. But within that is the point that I'm making is that sometimes we become involved in customs and in practices that we don't question. We just do those things. Christmas time, we just do Christmas. Sometimes we understand where it comes from. Sometimes we don't know the narrative that informs it. And I'd suggest there are many narratives that inform Christmas contemporarily. One of those being an economic narrative around buying presents and gifts for people that we don't usually talk to at any other time of the year, but we won't get into that, well, any more to say that there is a spiritual narrative, there's a political narrative around Christmas, a social narrative, those people we don't usually like talking to during the year come and visit us. There's an economic narrative that's all built into this one practice that we don't question because it's just Christmas. So from a Western perspective, that custom of Christmas is something we don't interrogate, we don't question, we don't think what it is. From my iwi Māori perspective, we have this custom of giving food back, of giving the first back to the land, to the sea. Something that just happens and we don't question. But they both inform our practice and both are informed by meta-narratives. So another thing we don't question, we've just talked about a couple of customs there. That idea of practice. There are practices that we become involved in that we don't question. Now, a very interesting practice is the idea of which side of the road that you drive on. Hey. Like in New Zealand here, we drive on the left. Where you guys are from, you drive on the other side. Whenever I go over there, over to North America, I'm always sort of looking the wrong way for cars. So like these practices that are culturally constructed, there's a term I want to hook up on later as well. These practices that we just do, that are just common sense, are informed by something. Once upon a time, someone decided which side of the road you drive on. And for some reason, down this end of the world, we're on the left. Your end of the world, it's on the right. So it's a strange thing. Who decided on these practices? And what informed the practices? Where do they come from? What are the stories, the narrative that informed the practices? And how do we, as individuals, then respond unwittingly to those practices? I'm going to see if I can turn this camera around here. Check this fella out. There's a wee bird walking around over here. He's called a weka. And he's just disappeared behind these trees. We'll go up and have a wee look. He's up in the bush there now. And now I've disturbed my tripod. But that idea of cultural practice, the things that we do. Like I said, when I'm on the other side of the world and they're driving on the wrong side of the road, I still look to see where the cars are coming from and walk out in the traffic at the wrong time. So the cultural practices inform the things that we do on an everyday basis, and those things that sometimes we don't question, we don't even think about. And those are some of the themes that we're going to be looking at in our journey here. So when we're thinking about place, that light's probably a wee bit better, eh? When we're thinking about place, we think about our position within that place. We think about how it informs our identity. We think about the practices that come from that, those things that we do that are informed by the mega narratives, the meta narratives. Those things that we question, those things that we just take for granted, those things that we don't question. So in our journey here, we're going to be revisiting some of these themes about culture, about place, about our identity, and also looking at other people, their place, their culture, their identity, and finding connections between those, finding out the similarities that we have with others, the differences, and hopefully working on ways that we can build a narrative together that lets us make sense of each other within place. So more from me later. It's great to be talking to you here from my place, almost at the top of the world, and I'll catch you again soon.